Good evening, everyone. Great crowd tonight. Good evening. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the National Building Museum. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me start off by telling you that the National Building Museum was created by an act of Congress in 1980 and housed in this amazing historic pension building. We're a private nonprofit whose mission is to advance the quality of the built environment by educating the public about its impact on people's lives. We do this through innovative programs such as tonight, family programs, youth and outreach events, or exhibitions, and the museum discusses issues related to architecture, planning, landscape architecture, engineering, and design. Chief among those issues is community development and an exploration of our urban environment. The museum is proud to provide a neutral forum for dialogue on these critical issues. Tonight is the first of a three-part series that will explore how arts and cultural infrastructure, and by that we mean libraries, museums, parks, concert halls, can create a critical mass of culture with the potential to redefine both the physical character and the civic identity of their communities. The series continues next month on March 14th with a panel looking at how cultural institutions impact the local economy of communities with representatives from Americans for the Arts, the Nelson Atkins Museum, and the author of a new University of Chicago report called Set in Stone. And that panel will be moderated by the architecture critic of the Philadelphia Inquirer, Inga Saffron. And then finally, on April 10th, the three-part series concludes with a program titled Industry to Art, which will explore how Rust Belt cities are transforming aging factories into art galleries, producing annual cultural events to draw outside visitors, and even offering grants to help artists relocate to cultural districts. Panelists will include the president of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, the co-founder of Detroit's Powerhouse Productions, the architect who designed Arts Quest, this amazing facility at the former Bethlehem Steel Foundry, and it will be moderated by the vice chairman of HR and A Advisors, Candace Damon. More information on this series is available on our website at nbm.org. And this series is generously funded by both the National Endowment for the Arts and McGraw-Hill Construction. Thank you to them both. Now, on to tonight's program. This evening, we have three cultural leaders from across the United States to engage in this topic. Each speaker will give a short presentation about their work, and then this will be followed by a moderated discussion, and we'll conclude with questions and answers to engage all of you in the discussion. Our speakers tonight, and they'll be coming up here in this order, are Ed Lebow, Director of Public Art at the Phoenix Office of Cultural Affairs. Ed will discuss the link between infrastructure and art and how his office tracks the economic impact of artistic installations. Since 1986, Phoenix has invested over $30 million in the arts. Our second speaker will be Victoria Rogers, who is the Executive Vice President of the New World Symphony in Miami. The New World Symphony's home is the New World Center, designed by Pritzker Prize-winning architect Frank Gehry, and features spaces for performances and presentations, a flexible and variable seating hall, performance hall, and a 7,000 square foot projection wall in which concerts, video art, and films are shown free of charge to audiences in Soundscape, a 2.5 acre public park designed by Dutch architectural firm West 8. And for those that might have seen the recent drawings by and sketches by Stephen Hall for the Kennedy Center, I know they were inspired in part by her institution. And our third speaker tonight is Mary Margaret Jones, who's a principal at Hargreaves Associates, where she served as senior principal in charge for many projects, including the 2000 Sydney Olympics Master Concept Design, Crissy Field in San Francisco's Presidio Park, and Discovery Green in Houston, Texas. She's currently leading the design for the Destination Bayfront in Corpus Christi, Texas, as well as a 70-acre Central Park for Oklahoma City. The firm has also worked on the Los Angeles River Park Master Plan and the Louisville, the Kentucky Riverfront Plan as well. And our moderator this evening will be the museum's own curator, Martin Moeller. With that, let's go ahead and start with Ed.
I think everybody has their own idea about what public art is, but this was mine. I grew up here in D.C., saw a lot of monuments, and when you look around the country, you see a lot of murals, sculptures, and memorials. But when I got to Phoenix many years ago, it became obvious that there were opportunities there for artists to do these kinds of things, turning them into these sorts of structures, working with engineers, architects, and a wide range of designers. So these kinds of features could become these through collaborations between artists and engineers. And these kinds of spaces could be transformed into these tree-lined historic canal sites that improved connectivity between neighborhoods and certainly included improving the public face of what we have and build. And then one of the better-known projects is this area, Arizona Falls, which was turned into this through, again, the same kinds of collaborations between artists, landscape architects, engineers, and frankly, the community. This kind of emphasis on infrastructure is nothing new. We travel all over the world to see infrastructure, in this case, the arrival of water, celebrating the arrival of water in the heart of Rome, which was a big deal in its day. Or these kinds of structures that deliver water. What was interesting and I think opportune about the Phoenix program is that we focused on these kinds of facilities because there was a sense that if a city is young and it's building itself, this is where you need to invest your design money. And thanks to Bill Morrish's and the late Catherine Brown's master plan for public art back in the 1980s, they worked with Deborah Whitehurst, then head of the agency, to really focus the city and give it a lens for looking at public art in a way that was very distinctive. They had been influenced, I think, strongly by the Seattle program and some of the other Western cities where you had much younger infrastructure, much greater range of opportunities than some of the older cities like DC or New York or Chicago where I grew up here. So they said, look at the water systems, look at the streets, the trails. All of these things were opportunities to involve artists in designing your area and, frankly, improving the way you look at your public facilities. How do you design a better place? This is the nature of the question in the 1980s. This is Black Canyon Freeway right through the heart of Phoenix. And what's interesting about this program and the urge to do better is that it didn't come from artists. It didn't come from curators. It came from the community, the civic leaders, community leaders who looked around and said, you know, when corporate come here to try and ask, do we want to put our company here? The first question that arises is, what's the quality of life? What's the quality of design? How can we improve those things? And so there was a direct economic factor involved in trying to improve the face of Phoenix. And it wasn't really exclusive to Phoenix. If you sort of stretch back 30, 40 years, back to the late 1950s and early 1960s, as the entire urban fabric of the United States was vastly either developing or undeveloping, you had people like Michael von Moschisker, who was with the Philly Redevelopment Authority and founded the first public art program in the United States. He looked around and said, you know, these buildings are unlovely, uninspired, and unforgivable. And you didn't have to look far to get examples of what he was talking about. This was replaced by this. And to take a broader view of the environment, you know, the Cuyahoga River caught fire regularly, the Detroit River caught fire regularly, and so when you think about art, you're really talking about, and public art in particular, you're talking about the urban environment and the environment beyond cities. And it was Lyndon Johnson who said at the White House Conference on Beauty in 1965 that, you know, modern technology has added so much to our lives, but it's a darker side. And so he also said that really we had to be more concerned with the using beauty to enhance our environment. Well, in Phoenix, roll forward into the 1980s, there had been a number of public art programs developed nationally, and I think we benefited from that. We also benefited from the fact that I said that it's a very young city. In 1988, there was close to a $1 billion bond campaign, and that may sound like not a lot now, but in its day, it was, I think, the single largest successful municipal bond campaign in the nation. And it covered a wide range of things that the city builds, and so it became the fuel to build and involve artists in what we build. Bridges, transit shelters, all of these things that you see up here, the things that are really, when you think of infrastructure, it's the greatest expression of common purpose that we have. These are the things we decide to do together, to build together. And we've done site-specific works, like these installations of Louise Bourgeois' work at the Convention Center. We have shade structures. We're out in the desert, need a lot of shade. And so we involve artists in designing shade, not only shade from overhead, but in the early morning you need shade at park and rides that comes across the horizon. You need shade from early morning sun. Fences, we have artists involved in those. Underpasses, terrazzo, lots of those. And then we have these unique collaborations, as I said, between artists and engineers, sort of rethinking how the experience of bridges could be, both from the outside and also from the inside. What's it like to cross a bridge on a major freeway in the middle of the day in summer? Well, this helps that a good deal. And then you have these kinds of expressions. Again, these unique collaborations. And so when the kids go to school from the community to their school each day, they have this living example of what geometry really does mean and what structure really does mean. We've also done a number of things to improve the connectivity between neighborhoods, trails in this case, where people have long used these trails. They were dirt along canals, but there weren't many amenities along those places to stop and rest, and so artists have been involved in developing those. And these things all change, I think, the appearance of the city. But one of the key points, and I think some of the most interesting work that goes on, not only in Phoenix, but nationally and internationally, is when you change and expand the function of the things you're building. Here's Arizona Falls in 1900. It was one of the only natural drops in the canal system that provides water to Phoenix. And by 1998, it had become this, a fenced-off hydroelectric dam project on the canals. Well, artists were involved with, again, engineers and Salt River Project, the federal government, to turn it into a destination along the canal where people could come and get close to the water in a way that hadn't been the case along the canal system for many, many years. And it's a place that is really cooler in the summer, and it's quite a destination. Another way that we looked at expanding function was back in the late 1980s. There was a visionary head of public works, Ron Jensen, and Ron knew long before sustainability was all the talk of the world that people who threw out their trash in Phoenix needed to understand where that trash went. They needed to have a much better sense of how their products are used and then go. This was the design that was proposed by Black & Veatch, the engineering firm, and it was a fairly traditional, out-of-sight, out-of-mind facility. And Ron Jensen knew that the city needed something more if it wanted to educate the public. And so they brought in Michael Singer and Lene Glott and a team to rethink what this center could be. And obviously there's an architectural expression here where the girders that would have been hidden inside previously are now exposed. There were gallery areas so people could go in and see their trash being processed. And this has since become sort of the standard for what we do in Phoenix. We have art exhibitions at the dump, which is, it's always prime for a headline, I would say, but people come there. 10,000 school kids a year come here to look at how the trash is processed and think about that. And it's since developed into a website as well. Habitat at the Convention Center. This actually uses condensate from the huge cooling towers of the Convention Center to water this wall here. And so it takes that water, waters the wall, and creates a new space outside that wouldn't have been there without this sort of innovative intervention. And it's not just downtown, but in neighborhoods like this, we've involved artists to really bring public art money to the fore to develop parks. Downtown civic space has been getting a lot of attention. It was this before, it became this through the design of Janet Eckelman's, and then at night through the lighting that Paul Deeb assisted in developing with Janet Eckelman. And I will tell you that when SkyTrain opens in the coming months, it's going to connect the light rail system in Phoenix to the airport terminals. These will be what people walk past on their way to the SkyTrain. Terrazzo floors by artists. What's often lost in discussions of public art and designing spaces is that the fact of who builds them. Well, this is who builds them. Once the floors are down, we forget that somebody made them. You know, the whole campaign about who made this, I made this, you didn't make that. Well, these guys make this. And, you know, they can stand up and say, we made this. And the reality in Phoenix, as we've tracked these numbers, has been pretty impressive. These are the people who are the art workers in Phoenix and for public art throughout the nation. And over the last, I think, 6 years, we've tracked about 55 projects, $27 million. About 80% of that is spent right in Phoenix. It gets spent locally. And so whenever the discussion about whether we should have enhancements on transit projects or other kinds of projects occurs here in Washington, you know, this is the reality I'm looking at. And during the depths of the recession, frankly, every other week, 3 weeks, I was getting calls from contractors, fabricators saying, what do you have coming along? Because these were jobs and good jobs and an opportunity for people to design really unique works for communities that will appreciate them for quite a long time. Thank you very much.
I'm Victoria Rogers, and I am going to talk with you a little bit about a project that we completed 2 years ago in Miami. So this tells you to come be inspired. This is actually a picture of the concert hall. We're performing a piece commissioned by Tom Addis with a video that went along to it. And part of what we do at the New World Symphony is to reimagine classical music. You know, in the day and age where orchestras are dying all over the world, I represent an institution, it's a training academy for people interested in working and performing in orchestras. So it's very important to us that we re-envision and reimagine what classical music can be for the future. We offer 3-year fellowships to 86 young men and women. Where they come, they stay with us, we provide them housing, we pay them a stipend. And they learn how to work as an ensemble. Michael Chilson Thomas founded this institution 25 years ago with Ted Arison, the founder of Carnival Cruise Lines, as our major benefactor. But we served as a catalyst, a true cultural catalyst for the redevelopment of the Miami Center. This is what was before. This is the plan that shows the park that we think of as our front lawn. The city thinks of it as Soundscape Park. Our building in the center, and a parking garage that connects to the New World Center. As Scott said, designed by Frank Gehry, the park by Adrian Guza of West 8, Dutch firm which also has an office in New York. This is what resulted. The New World Center, which was built on the design premise that art should be accessible, that there should be no barrier to access. And even though we're in Miami, 2 blocks from the ocean to our east, you have a front curtain wall that is glass. The park is about 2.5 acres, and the park was designed, as you can see it here, in the northern corner up there, to have an unobstructed view of that 7,000 square foot wall. So when we began this project 10, almost 12 years ago now, it was, what can classical music become? And what type of a building do you need that will support it? So right now we find ourselves truly at the intersection of architecture, education, classical music, and technology. So this building is fully wired for anything. The reason I started with a description of what the New World Symphony is because this building was designed for its programs. Frank Gehry has said it is the most program-designed building he's ever built. We knew what we wanted to do. We teach a lot around the world from this building. We have a program in Medellin, Colombia, where we teach over the internet on a weekly basis, and then every 2 months we actually go down and work with the young musicians. But our fellows can take a class from anyone in the world through either Internet 2 or Skyping. This is the Atrium, and you can see how light it is. I was trained as a classical musician, and I don't know how many of you in the audience were, but the majority of our time was spent in a room by yourself. Interpersonal skills may not be the top thing that a musician has, although they may have phenomenal technical prowess. So in this building, Michael wanted it to have natural light. We have 27 practice rooms. We have 4 different ensemble rooms. You're looking at one now, the Bruce Clinton room. But with the front curtain wall and every single space having glass in it, you get a tremendous amount of natural light, but you also get accessibility. If you're outside of our building and you look through that front curtain wall, you can see our musicians. You start to get an understanding of what it takes to be a classical musician. Even our concert hall has a glass wall that you'll see in a minute. But this is our Wallcast. So what we did, what you're seeing on the wall is a live performance. So we're performing in the concert hall, which is a 756-seat hall. But outside in the park, we have gotten as many as 3,000 people, 42 of which are new. Many of them have never experienced a classical music concert anywhere. So out here, you come, it is free to you. Obviously, it's not free to us. We fund it through foundations and corporations and people making donations. And if you'll see in the right-hand corner over there, there's a text message. The text message will say, text this number and download program notes. Again, free of charge. So you can download the program notes about the music that's being performed, the performers, the conductor, information about the new World Symphony. And then another time, there'll be a message that comes up and says, if you really are enjoying what you're doing, and if you would like to text a donation, please feel free to do so. So there, Michael Chilson Thomas was the founder, as I said earlier. Before every concert, because we firmly believe that if communities start to understand orchestras as people, not just as a group that is up on the stage, and as members of the orchestra become fully ingrained in their community, that when issues arise, when funding is tough, there's a better understanding between both parties. So before every one of our concerts, whether you're sitting inside the hall or outside in the park, you'll see a 2-minute video that is of one of our fellows talking about his or her aspirations and what the New World Center is doing to help them achieve that. So within this area, which is the full immersion sound, you can see that the ballet bars, what we call them, the elephant bars, there are 186 speakers within that system. So when you sit in that middle section, even though you've got Miami, you can see the Art Deco buildings in the back, the ocean is behind that. This is 17th Street on the left, Washington Avenue in front of it. It's one of the busiest intersections that you can find in Miami. All you hear is the music. So for that, for whatever duration of the concert, you're watching them perform live, you're hearing the music live. And as I said to someone earlier, one of the best things is all of these people are bringing their lawn chairs, their blankets, they bring food. It's multi-generational, which is an amazing thing, to see grandparents bringing grandchildren. The New World Symphony, I think I mentioned, just celebrated its 25th anniversary. We have people who came as kids who are now bringing their grandchildren to these concerts. But it's also extremely diverse. It's very representative of our city. In addition to our Wallcast, we work a lot with the city of Miami Beach, and we do different types of performance formats to bring in a new audience to classical music. All things that can be replicated by other orchestras wherever they are. This was following what we call a mini concert. A mini concert is you can come and hear 30 minutes of really good classical music for $2.50. And all you have to do is spend 30 minutes of your time. You're off, you can walk in off of Lincoln Road, you go in. This was an affinity group, so we're trying to, again, build that audience. So this affinity group were 700 yogis that came to a concert inside and then went out into the park. We projected images for them, and they did a yoga class and meditation following it. We also do movie nights for the City of Miami Beach on Wednesday nights. Thursday nights, City of Miami Beach does opera. So on numerous nights throughout the week, you can enjoy a concert or a movie. And then when that's not going on, we commissioned Tal Rosner to do a piece for our wall, which was based on 50,000 photographs that were taken of the building while it was being constructed, as well as Lincoln Road, Ocean Drive. Casey Rios created an algorithm. It never repeats itself, and it's like a European clock. On the hour, it changes. So the wall is always activated in some way. But what we do to engage our community also goes on inside of the hall. We really serve as the research and development arm for the classical music community. So we work with orchestras, Europe, Latin America, and across the US to try to come up with new ways of presenting classical music that will engage an audience. So in our hall designed by Frank, if you've been to Disney Hall, this is a mini version of Disney Hall. The difference is the acoustical sails on the top are also projection sails. So we have 16 cameras within the hall. So when we do a Wallcast, it's like a television production. It takes 132 hours to produce it with someone sitting with a score, calling all of the shots that are going to be done. And they practice during every rehearsal. But the, excuse me, the stage can be lowered and raised and set in 13 configurations. There are alternate performance platforms within the hall. This was taken from a recent, we did a 3-day festival of John Cage. So you can see how the hall is used. We actually floated a helium balloon and projected some of John Cage's musings upon it. This is also from the Cage performance. We brought in Merce Cunningham dancers. But you can see how the stage is reset to facilitate whatever we're trying to do, and how above it we can show just about whatever we can imagine that can be shown. So this was actually the combination of archival footage from Merce Cunningham dancers with 2 of his, the most recent Cunningham dancers that actually are in Miami. We also do a lot of commissioning of new works. So this is a piece that was commissioned by Emily Eckstein, who's a USC graduate, and she designed this to go with Stravinsky's Circus Polka. So a lot of what we do is commissioning new works of music and video art. So we're trying to see if you can create sight and sound. Can you create visual images where the music isn't the backdrop, but where the music is as important as the visual image that you see? And so a lot of our focus going forward is on creating these kinds of images and then working with the artist, because here you're designing for 5 different sales. But most concert halls aren't done in the round. Think about it. Our volume is up, but in a normal concert hall, it's directly in front of you, so they would have a single projector. One of the other things that we experiment with is called a pulse concert. It starts at 9 p.m. at night and goes to 1 a.m. in the morning, and I usually last till midnight, and that's the end of me. But it's a combination of electronica and really edgy classical music. We will have up to 2,000 people move through the hall in an evening. And what we decided to do was, because it gets loud in there, it's done like a club, you can sit all the way around it, you can stand, there are different parts where people will dance, but we also used one of our other spaces to create Pulse Unplugged. So if you want to just go in and listen to the music, you can go in and listen to our kids performing what they had just done in the hall. And again, in addition on the sales, we're projecting program notes. So it's all about reimagining and re-envisioning what classical music can do. We love this Frank Gehry building. He created it as though it's a proscenium stage, and all of the spaces, which are extremely unique, and when they're lit at night, they become the actors on the stage. So you can see it from outside. It always attracts attention, and it's helping us to create great visibility for this art form. But it has been a dream come true, It took us 10 years to do it. We started it during the economic apocalypse. I can tell you some of the questions that we'll talk about later. The building is completely paid for, and we added $30 million to the endowment. The land was donated to us. It's a perfect view of a public-private partnership. The land was donated to us by the city of Miami Beach. We had a very generous contribution from Miami-Dade County, and then the rest of the money was raised privately. So we are not in debt with it, completely paid off. And now it's the promises of the building. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to use it? How are we going to capitalize on this beautiful thing that Frank has given us? And how do we use it to promote our fellows, to give them a competitive edge, and to work with our community? So thank you.
I'm Margaret Jones. I'm a landscape architect, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what parks can do as cultural drivers in our cities. And I have a number of projects to show you, so I'm going to move through them fast, and I won't describe them in full. I'm only going to talk about a couple of aspects of each of these. This is Houston, Texas, and I think you can see, this is our park site, and you can see that it's pretty much surrounded by surface parking lots and kind of a vast landscape. And this is what the park looked like afterwards. So it's a 12-acre park that links downtown to the George R. Brown Convention Center and a Hilton Hotel here, but the arena is on one end and the Minute Maid ballpark is on the other. So it became something that really stitched together downtown and created an address where none existed before. And performances happen there. There's an amphitheater slope. Under that amphitheater slope is a parking structure. Under the lake is a parking structure, and sometimes the lake is frozen for ice skating. So there's always something going on, and there's free movies, and there's dance, and there's jazzercise, and there's yoga, and there's something going on all the time. And this allée of beautiful historic oaks at Christmas time becomes a place where artists put the faces of Houstonians on these big glowing balls, and it becomes really an expression of the place. And the entrances, the pedestrian entrances to the parking structure below were designed by an artist, Texas artist, Margot Sawyer. And they're colorful places that bring light down in the parking structure below and animate the park. Doug Hollis did this piece. They're called listening vessels, and you can sit in them. They're about 60 feet apart, and you can sit in them and whisper, and the person sitting in the other one can hear you perfectly. So they just become a part of the animation of the park and the activity of the park. Doug also did a fountain piece, which you don't see here, but he did a fountain piece called The Mystery. So just to talk a little bit about how this works, these were the conditions of the site before we started. So downtown, Four Seasons, Toyota Center, Hilton, Convention Center, Minute Maid Park, surface parking, a lot of surface parking. This is what's already happened. And as soon as the park started construction, the developers started building. It was just an immediate transformation. And it's been almost $1 billion worth of investment surrounding this park. People said no one will come, it'll be overcome with homeless people. Well, it's just not been the case. Kids come in busloads, and people come in droves, and there's a restaurant, and there's a cafe, and they're busy all the time. And you can see the programming. This is the programming schedule for just, 2 or 3 months. So there's something happening all the time. Similarly, in Chattanooga, we were asked by the mayor to come up with a plan that would reconnect the city to the river and create value to downtown and development sites as well as a park edge to the river. And you can see this is after it's built, all of this edge, which is also a flood-controlled levee. So it was a matter of controlling floods and creating places for people so that the levee becomes an amphitheater. And we worked with local artists. This is Ross's Landing. This is one of the embarkation points of the Trail of Tears. So we worked with Native American artists. We came up with the idea of the jets, which represent the number of tribes that left from there and the tears of these tribes. And there's medallions all up and down this fountain designed by these local Native American artists. So heavily used, festivals, fireworks. light fixtures designed by the artist Jamie Carpenter that go out on the pier that goes out over the water. And it's brought back not only all this development, over $800 million worth of development. And this is all, we're not just claiming any development that happened downtown and saying it happened because of the park. These are developments that have stated that the reason they developed in downtown Chattanooga was because of the city's investment in its riverfront and because of the waterfront park. They're saying we're coming here because we want our residents, our employees, et cetera, to be here. It also brought back the Head of the Hooch. The Head of the Hooch is a big regatta, big race, kayaking race, rowing race, and it's back in Chattanooga now. I wanted to touch on this one briefly just because to make a little bit of a tie to the previous presentation. This is nearby. This is South Point Park, also in Miami Beach. And it restores dunes. It creates this playful promenade that creates topography on a site that has amazing views out over Governor's Cut, and a promenade along that edge with lights that were carefully designed to not disturb the turtle breeding grounds at night. A sort of amphitheater space that overlooks this spray ground, sort of sculptural spray ground, and again gives you these great views over Governor's Cut. So it invites, I was there recently on vacation and went to the park every day. I was staying nearby, and we got stranded here because of the hurricane in New York. We couldn't go back to New York. Oh, darn. So we had to stay here. And we rode bikes here every day, and it was amazing to watch people doing yoga, doing dance classes, taking capoeira classes. They're with their dogs, they're with their kids. It was really great to watch it, how it's become part of the life of the neighborhood. And the neighborhood was just written up in the New York Times. I'm sure you saw that. All the housing that's being built here now, and this is one of the reasons. Los Angeles, this site was our site, a site to become a park, as you can see in sort of the foot of LA. A site that had an amazing history. This was to be a state historic park. You can see in this slide, at one time it was all rail yards, and we really used the pattern of those rail yards to inform the design of the park. But it also had many other layers of history. It was once part of the river itself. You can't really tell, but there's a river there. See that bridge? Yeah, that's a river. So at one time it was part of the river. Some Native Americans settled here. Japanese Americans were interred here before they were put on trains and sent to concentration camps. This was the area of the Chavez Ravine riots, where people were forced off of this land to make way for Dodger Stadium. So a really, really deep history. We had people come to public meetings and cry as they talked about this piece of land. So it needed to be more than just a park. It needed to be an interpretive place, a place that would tell these stories. So you can see the notations on the plan. First of all, I think you can see the sort of striations reflecting the railroad striations of the past, but you can also see all these different what we called circuits and portals and places where you could tap into media, places where you could visit places that would tell you stories within the park, whether it was stories about water, whether it was stories about the cultural past, gardens, architecture. We worked with Michael Malston, architect, and Ralph Applebaum Associates in terms of helping us tell these stories. There was at one time a bridge across the site where the poor people who lived on one side would walk across the railroad yards on this bridge to the upper land where they would go to work every day, and so they'd go back and forth every day. And there was a water wheel, so it was all about transporting water as well. So we came up with this idea of a water wall and these fountains that would move like trains along these tracks. And these places of respite where in these shade structures were cut out words. So as you sat here, these words would wash over you. And these were words that would have different meanings depending on your perspective. So development, food, displacement, progress. So words that, depending on your frame, would have a different meaning. And then on the site, underneath the stage, an actual archaeological site. So this is where the roundhouse was when it was rail yards. So exposing that archaeological site. So many levels of interpretation, many levels of experience. One that got built, the one in Los Angeles, has not yet been built, I'm sorry to say. Those of you who followed the problems when Schwarzenegger was governor and we stopped all bond-funded projects, and the California State Parks system is still under attack, to be honest. But this one was built. This is a national park. This is in San Francisco. It was a national landmark. It's where the biplanes landed in the 1920s. First airmail took off from here, called Crissy Field. It was also once the part of the bay. So we had to design this 100-acre park to both be an airfield, a grassy airfield, and be a tidal marsh. So a palimpsest approach to restoring both of those conditions on the site. And one of the historic entries to the Presidio of San Francisco, which is always marked by a grove of cypress trees. So hundreds of thousands of people, I think a million a year, come to Crissy Field. And it's a really beautiful place where kids learn about our ecological history and our cultural history. And then finally, I just wanted to conclude with our most recent project that hopefully some of you saw on TV for the London Olympics. You can see in the top image, top left image, that's what the site was like. It was well, this is after they took down the buildings. Before they took down the buildings, it was all old industrial buildings. The River Lee, which was a channelized river, it was a matter of taking that river and laying back the banks, sculpting the banks, creating a park not only for the games, but a park that would extend out post-games and be a legacy for generations to come. So 274 acres along this restored river that worked during the games for hundreds of thousands of people to gather and watch the games being projected on those big screens, but that also works when there's two people there enjoying the wildlife, incredible amounts of wildlife now along this river. And the 2012 gardens, where plants were brought from all over the world representing all the countries that come to the games and forming a setting for Amish Kapoor's major iconic piece for the games. And various pieces of art. The whole park is infused with art. This one I love to end with. Run.
It struck me that there were quite a few initiatives in cities underway to really recast the sense of place in those communities through cultural facilities. And I'm defining cultural facilities broadly, more about which in a moment. These were more than just the individual institutions. The Guggenheim Bilbao, as impressive as and important as a project as that was, it seemed that there was some bigger thinking going on. And interestingly, with the recession coming around not long after that, there was a lot of hand-wringing and people saying, well, this is an end of an era. We're not going to be getting any more of those Guggenheim Bilbaos. We're going to be doing much more modest things. We may not even be getting as many cultural facilities. And I felt like that death knell was, if nothing, premature. And I really don't think it was correct at all. Within a week after an infamous article in the New York Times saying that that era was over, I saw announcements of 4 or 5 major cultural projects. And it's just continued. And I think the reason is that people really do have a sense that cultural facilities contribute a great deal to the community. And that's really what this is all about. And there was another thing that was important about this, I think, for us, and that was to begin to look at cultural facilities more broadly. And it's an interesting cross-section here. We're not talking just about museums and libraries and performing arts centers. We've talked here about a public art program. We've talked about a symphony hall, but obviously an educational center, and clearly one that is doing a variety of things beyond just the typical performances. And we've talked a lot about landscape. Really, that unites all of these speakers. There are heavy landscape components here. So that's kind of the background behind this, which I think is important to understand. But beyond that, I'd like to begin by picking up on what all of you started to do very well, which is to talk about the economic impact of this, of these institutions and places that you've created. Do you find yourself in a defensive position at times? Are people questioning the value of these admittedly expensive endeavors and saying, well, you know, we've got crumbling school buildings and crumbling roads. How do you justify these expenditures on public art or public places or cultural institutions? There is a public component to that, as you say, from the governments and the donation of the land and so on. So how do you respond to those kinds of critiques, if you get them at all? Feel free to dive in. Maybe Ed, will start with you.
Since I'm a public official, I guess I can. It's something I hear a lot. You hear it on talk radio, you hear it in some community meetings, but the other thing you do hear is people wanting to live in beautiful, interesting places. And so occasionally there's a disconnect between what I'm hearing in the communities and what is in the airwaves. It's a really interesting question because, referred to the White House Conference on Natural Beauty, is that Johnson said that you can't really quantify beauty. It's hard to quantify. But he felt that it was fundamental to the nation's well-being. 2 years ago, the Knight Foundation and Gallup polling organization began polling. It's sort of the soul of the community report, it's called. And they began polling, I think, 26 different communities around the nation. And what came from that report is really fascinating because you would think that jobs and all those things related to the economy would be number 1, 2, 3. Well, no. What's 1, 2, and 3 is aesthetics, social networks, that is, social opportunities, and then the openness of places. And in fact, what they found was that those communities that had the greatest attachment, that is, why people loved living where they lived living where they live, and those places, it turns out, also had the highest GDP growth. And so you have this direct connection between people wanting to be where they are and businesses wanting to be where they are, and the aesthetics of a place.
That it's not just spending money on dessert. That's what somebody said to me. We have to eat our broccoli before we can have our dessert. We have to fix our roads before we make parks. And I had to say, no, the parks are the meat and potatoes of the meal just as much as roads are. Roads don't make great cities. A whole number of things make great cities. And it is an economic benefit. That's what we're able to point to so many case studies of these kinds of facilities, this kind of fabric of a city having a direct impact on the economics of the city, the retention of your young people, the attraction of businesses. We have cities come to us and hire us to make things like Discovery Green because they try to get a Boeing or they try to get somebody else headquarters and they go somewhere else. And when they say why, it's because, well, we went to this place that had more culture, that had more parks, that had more livability.
I'm going to actually quote you some numbers that I wrote down. We just finished an arts and economic prosperity study for Miami that was done by Miami-Dade County and Americans for the Arts. In Miami alone, the impact of arts organizations is over $1 billion. For every dollar, and I think this is the argument that we have to get to using, it is not either or. The arts actually bring in more money than you spend on them, which is what people don't tend to understand, but we're providing the money that can be used to build schools and can be used to build roads. But in Miami right now, we employ in the arts over 30,000 full-time people. For every $1 of county art funding, we leverage $31 from private investors that are giving back to the arts. For every dollar that is spent, cultural arts organizations produce at least $8 in tax revenue. And in Miami alone right now, over the next 2 years, with our building, the Miami Art Museum, which is now the Perez Museum, the new Science Museum, Miami Art Museum is being done by Herzog and de Moran, we're spending $1 billion of public and private money to invest in the arts. Rocco Landesman said on his last visit to Miami, he's the head of the National Endowment for the Arts, former, he wondered what was in the Miami water, what's going on that is making this successful. And I think a lot of it is that people are coming and living in Miami now because of the arts, but because they're starting to see Miami not as just Sun and Miami Vice, but as a real innovator of ideas. We recently held a conference done by the Atlanta Magazine within our center. We had a full hall of people talking about coming to Miami to invest their money entrepreneurs, not just in culture, but in technology and new ideas that are truly going to make that city even more than it is now.
A couple of you hit, did you
Well, I just wanted to follow up. You know, it's the same report. When you look at all these studies, it's a $300 million industry in the Phoenix area, and 9,600, close to 10,000 jobs. But when that question arises, it often comes from people not really understanding that not all dollars are equal. We get the question often, I may as well sort of bring it up here, is, well, why are you doing this instead of hiring more teachers, hiring more police, more fire? What's often misunderstood is the money to build stuff can't be used to operate. And so there's just a general civics lesson that, you know, needs to go on. Mary Margaret talks about the civics lesson about the meat and potatoes, but you know, these are things that cities need. And when you look at all the studies, the reality is that cities are diverse economies, and the arts are a pretty big part of that.
That's a perfect transition to my next question, which is that often for these projects, there's a huge capital campaign to raise money for the, forgive the now cliche, bricks and mortar. And there's been some criticism about the ongoing sustainability, financial sustainability of these kinds of efforts. And Victoria, you alluded to that with your good position. Maybe you could expand on that, Victoria. How well set are you in terms of ongoing activities? And then I'd like the others to join in too for your projects. How do you ensure maintenance of those public artworks and those parks in which you've been working?
When we began this project, we looked and, you know, we started, as I said earlier, with the programming. And what we wanted to do, we then took to theater projects that translated that into square footage. And so by the time it got to Gary Partners, they knew what the square footage was, and then Frank envisioned the building. But that was only one part of it. The other part of it was growing the endowment that would cover the additional cost. We moved from 45,000 square feet, sort of a one-room schoolhouse, into a 106,000 square foot academic center filled with technology. So we did studies on what it was going to cost us to run the building. Gary Partners did tremendous light studies. We knew what the load was going to be. I mean, we really looked at the costs. And you know, sometimes the bane of arts organizations is the belief that they're run poorly. I know a tremendous number of arts organizations that are run extraordinarily well, ours being one of them. So that we look at what is it going to cost you to do this on an annual operating basis. Unlike many art institutions, we were blessed with an endowment. When Ted Arison helped to found us, that was one of the things he did. He bought the apartments so our fellows would have a place to live. He bought the theater at the Lincoln Road. And he created an endowment. And over the last 25 years, all of our fundraising addresses not only annual operating, but also having the endowment to run it. And but you know, arts organizations have to depend upon philanthropy and the largesse of people around them, which is why we focus on, if your community understands you, then it can alleviate a lot of the issues when money gets tight for a city.
Mary Margaret, how about for your projects?
Oh, it's absolutely an issue. When from day one, or day 3 of design process, we start looking at maintenance and operations. And it's important in our case that we not just talk about maintenance, because it's not just mowing grass, it's operations and programming. Our Louisville Waterfront Park that somebody mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned earlier, has 14 full-time people. I mean, you have to program these places and bring the activity. So you have to build a financial model for that from the beginning, because the cost of operations and maintenance within 20 years will cost more than the capital outlay in the first place to build the facility. And so you need to realize that up front, and you need to plan for it. And then there are any number of ways, from revenue generation within the park, from cafes and restaurants and parking, to philanthropy, friends of conservancies. It's very important to set up conservancies because they can raise money like city governments can't, or state governments or federal governments can't. And then with parks, there's also business, there's district. You can set up adjacent districts, and you can look to assessments. So as all that development happens around these parks, it gives back to the parks, and that's a major way we're able to make some of these parks happen. Is that the development around gives back to the maintenance and operation of the parks.
Turns out
endowments.
both Victoria and I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, so we were very complimentary of that project.
It's a
Ed, how
beautiful,
about from your
it's a
perspective?
beautiful project.
Well, ditto. It's a huge challenge, and it's increasingly so because money to maintain things comes from general fund revenues in cities. Well, those are the funds that are really have been hammered over the last 4, 5, 6 years. And so, you know, if Mary Margaret is a consultant working on a project, on a public art project in Phoenix, she's right. Day 3, it would be, let's see the concept, and then let's start thinking about ways that it can be self-sustaining. The disadvantage, I think, and it's not just public art, but it's American governance in general, is that we like to build things. Maintaining things is something that's a little bit harder to sell. It's not sexy. You can't point to something specific. But everybody feels it when there are potholes in their streets, when the parks are shabby, when sidewalks are destroyed. These are things people feel and understand, and so it takes a very significant education campaign among the electorate that if you're going to build something, you need to be able to develop the funds to maintain it. And as Mary Margaret pointed out, and you pointed out, you have all kinds of partnerships, cities looking for all kinds of ways to find those funds in a tax-limited era.
No, go ahead.
No, let me one more comment. Scott mentioned earlier that you're going to have a speaker about the paper that's going to be presented, Set in Stone. I encourage you all to come to that lecture. They came down, and the folks who are researching and writing that came down and spent a day with us about 3 weeks ago. And we're one of the examples of a project that has worked. Knock on wood, to find wood somewhere, and will continue to work.
I usually use my head.
Yeah, continue to work going forward. But it is a lot of planning, and it's looking at all of your potential sources of revenue. So for us, it's not just philanthropy, and it's not just ticket sales, because we have a small hall, and no orchestra is ever going to be able to support itself by selling tickets to their concerts. You can't possibly do it. But we rent out our facility a lot to third-party renters. And so we're doing all kinds of different things that use the technology in the building to enable corporations to talk to anybody they want to talk to. So it's, you know, you have to look at every source of revenue, and you build it, as Mary Margaret said, into your plan, and you test that plan. When we were building ours, we looked at a low use, a medium use, and a full use of the building and what the costs would be, and then we made decisions based upon that kind of planning on how we were going to move forward.
Again, a great transition. It's almost as if you'd seen these questions in advance. But let's face it, not all cultural projects are great successes. And I wonder if any of you have experienced just things you've seen elsewhere. You don't even necessarily have to identify them by name, but what are some of the pitfalls? What are some things that have gone wrong with other developments of the kinds with which you're familiar? And how have you avoided those? I think you probably hit on that a little bit, Victoria in particular, but what are some of those challenges and risks that are not always caught?
Well, there are no failures.
Really?
You are in politics, after all.
I think.
No.
Go ahead, Ed. Surely you're going to follow that up. Go ahead.
I think it's pretty easy to see projects in our city, around the nation, that aren't thought about holistically. That is, people think of public art as some kind of way to solve a problem that it cannot solve. And so you see that. You see efforts to fix bad architecture, or bad public space planning, or bad landscape architecture. Let's throw an artist at it. They'll fix it. Well, they won't fix it, and sometimes they'll make it worse. And so from the get-go, you really have to think about the whole picture of what is being designed. And that's where the success is built. It's in the beginning, long before pencil gets on paper. You have to think clearly about what you can achieve by putting all these professionals together. I was just walking down 6th Avenue the other day, and there was a huge sculpture in front of a huger building, all the shoebox buildings up there along 6th Avenue. As if, what is that going to contribute to the public space? Nothing, really, nothing. And Paley Plaza, just around the corner, contributes a whole lot more. And so there's an example of a huge thing that does not do much for your street, and a small thing that does an awful lot for the comforts and beauty of a big city.
I think the fact that we're all talking about integral solutions has a lot to do with successes versus non-successes. When it's an integral solution of art, architecture, infrastructure, landscape, it has a better chance of success. And then in my world, when you can't just build it and walk away. The same in your world. You can't just build it and walk away. It has to be about a life beyond the day it opens. It has to be about programming, and programming has to be part of the design process, and then has to be staffed, and has to be funded, and has to be cared for.
Have any of you encountered any turf wars, perhaps literally or figuratively, since we're talking about landscape to a large extent, that you had to negotiate your way through? Obviously, you're dealing with often public-private partnerships. Did people have a certain kind of vested interest that you had to disinvest them of? Or how do you balance all of those kinds of needs of the community, corporate interests, donors, artists? All those things come into play.
Well, I can start with Chrissy Field, because as a national park, we had to work with the cultural resources staff of the National Park Service and the natural resources staff of the National Park Service. And the cultural resources staff only wanted to restore a grassy airfield exactly as the airfield would have existed when the biplanes landed there, and to the point of wanting the grass to be killed every day by a truck or something in the same pattern that it would have been killed by taking off airplanes. The natural resource staff people only wanted a restored wetland. Damn people, let's just restore the wetland. And then and neither of them cared if anybody ever came. Neither of them were really about people. And then we had the dog walkers in San Francisco who didn't really want it to change because it was just fine the way it was for walking their dogs, running their dogs every day. So it's a negotiation of territory that has to be a kind of understanding of everybody's goals, and bringing together and combination solutions and public process. And
we used to describe it as avoiding the landmines. Some that you could sort of see, and others that you had no clue what you were getting ready to walk into. I have experience with both. But it was interesting. The cities don't always get along with their county agencies and vice versa, so that was interesting. Miami is very lucky to have a number of wonderful parks, but it has a very strong tennis group and dog lovers, and so there was a tremendous amount of discussion about what this relatively tiny 2.5-acre park could possibly be. And at one meeting, we were sitting there like this going, well, now you'll have a green space about the size of a dime and nothing else. And it takes a lot of skill to negotiate with people, and it takes, you have to stay focused. The worst thing for us was the Performing Arts Center, which was the night Performing Arts Center, and then I think it was Carnival, and then it became the Adrian Arsht Center for the Performing Arts of Miami-Dade. Took much longer and went way over its budget for a lot of reasons, a lot of bad things that happened. And so here we are building what everybody else thought of as a performing arts center. We're not a performing arts center. We're an academy. But trying to make that differentiation with them, so by the time I could explain to them what we really were, it was exhausting. So we did a lot of campaigns for that. We did a lot on classical music radio stations. We negotiated with everybody. We had a lot of charrettes where people could begin to understand what we were really trying to accomplish with this. And we worked a lot with both, Adrian Goose from West Dade, and of course Craig Webb, who was our lead designer from Gary Partners, to negotiate those waters.
Ed, anything to add to that?
Well, I feel like an amateur coming to Washington to talk about turf wars, seriously. I came here in December to see the Fiscal Cliff and we'll paint it because it's beautiful at sunset, and now it's the sequester. And so turf wars are kind of the nature of democracy, and they're the nature of bureaucracies and community work. It's just the way it is in this country. And so if you can't work with people and figure out what the common interests are among different groups, you kind of need to get out of the business. Yes, there are turf wars all the time. And I have the experience of having been with the public art program way back in the 80s when it got going, and then came back in 2005 to run it. I can tell you that the tenor of the discussion is completely different. After almost a quarter century of doing this stuff, it's bring you into the room, bring everybody into the room. Let's figure out how to do this. And that's the way it is that this common sense that, yeah, there are turf wars and there are disagreements, but flip that around. Turf wars are based on expertise that people have and interests that people have. Those are the things you want them involved for and not the other stuff of power. And so get their interests and their intelligence involved in a project, and it'll be a better project. But if you don't bring them all into the room, you're going to suffer for it.
All of you obviously have criteria for measuring success. We've talked about some of those already, financial, visitorship, those kinds of things. But are there other criteria that you use for measuring success? How do you really get a sense, and presumably that's something that changes over time. How do you get a sense of how you're doing, and how can you make adjustments in what you do in the future? Ed, you want to start with that one?
Sometimes we're not the best judge. History sort of has a way of playing things out, and things that you think are successful projects when they go in, what grows in around them over the years? What kind of organics are there in the community or in the city that change the surroundings to either make it a success, make it a dead space? These are things you can't predict, but in the short term, I get back to expanding the function of things. Is that there was a gentleman named Lawrence Miles, and Lawrence Miles was the father of efficiency engineering, value engineering. And he came out of General Electric, Sperry, and he was convinced that aesthetics was fully half of what you value in a project. That's all been changed over the years, but people forget that he knew that if you're trying to sell products to the American consumer, they cared about how the stuff looked. And if you're designing public spaces, you should care about how these things look. He believed back in the 1970s that we were in an age that was developing not new products, not new objects, but new functions. I mean, everybody, you have a cell phone in your pocket? How many different things does that one cell phone do? I've got an old Motorola Razr, which is antiquated. It can do several things. So why shouldn't the infrastructure and public spaces that we design and cultural facilities have that same flexibility? And you have examples here of what those successes have done. Your building is like an iPhone. It does many different things. Your spaces are the same deal. That's where we're headed, and that's where the success of these projects ultimately will play out.
And I was actually going to disagree with you. My first statement was going to be one of the ways I can tell success is when I love going to the places we design and taking people to visit those places and just going there every day because they make me feel good. So I think to some degree we can be measures of whether something is a success or not. But it's also true that time will tell. And in the case of parks, it'll be more interesting in facilities like yours, but in the case of parks, they have to evolve. I mean, in some ways, we don't design a landscape, we set a landscape in motion because it will die, it will grow, it will change, it will evolve. So those systems, those open-ended systems, are part of what we have to embrace.
We judge our success in a number of different ways. I think looking forward, we judge it by the type and the quality of the musicians that apply for our program. And I can tell you with the tremendous visibility that we have gotten through this Frank Gehry building and the programs that we're designing, we have 1,300 applicants for 30 positions every year. So that's one degree of our success. We look at it by our fellows being hired by orchestras. And that's a little bit dicey because sometimes orchestras aren't hiring. But what do they do with their careers? Do they last? I mean, long term. Are they able to keep the type of enthusiasm that they have right now? Their average age is 24. So if they're in this for the long haul, can they continue to approach classical music with the same vim and vigor that they do now? But with the building of itself, I think our success will be how we use it and how it's seen. The Miami Beach Convention Center is going to be renovated, and it sits directly across the street from us. And they had one of the first open town hall meetings for what people thought it ought to be. And there was this wonderful response for them saying, don't do anything that messes with Soundscape Park or the Frank Gehry building. And I'm sitting there going, woohoo! Because they get it. They love this facility. They think of it as theirs. We're finding out that they come to it for all kinds of reasons. It's great date night. It's bring your family night. It's kid night. But one of the most amazing things to me is they clean up when they leave. There is no garbage in that park. There's no violence in that park. So it's completely changed the landscape. And I would say it's a growing, living organism as well, to see where it goes and how it evolves over the next 25 years. But the building and the park and the integration of those, and the fact that you can park and walk into our building from your car, and then you can go out into this beautiful green space, is a unique way to enjoy classical music.
I think it's interesting that we're all talking about things that are free. That it's all part of the public realm. So we're bringing culture to people in a way, and they're not having to pay for it. It just becomes a part of their life and their daily experience. And I think that's making a huge difference.
Yeah, it does.
Well, with regard to Miami Beach, probably a lot of people in this room, like me, have been to Miami and Miami Beach many times for vacation, go to get someplace to get warm. But after a while, you start to look for something new to do. And people are now starting to go to the Wolfsonian Museum.
Absolutely.
And starting to go to your institution. And so based on that, Ed and Victoria in particular, how do you see your communities growing culturally over the years, largely based on your efforts, but even beyond that? Where do you think you might be 10, 15, 20 years from now? And Mary Margaret, you could chime in for any of the communities that you've been involved with. How do you think this is going to end up?
Well, Phoenix has gone from being a city that sort of prided itself in having suburban aspects to a city that now has a light rail line running through the heart of it, and much greater interest in moving near the light rail, being able to walk to work, walk to school, walk to your community. And so all these kinds of things are going to change the nature of the cultural involvement and also how people feel attached to the city. How those things grow in over the years to create greater density along light rail, more things to do, more places to be that enjoy, and I would agree with Mary Margaret and Victoria both, is, that's the success of a place when you love being there. And, that's where it's headed. It's going to become an increasingly urban place because that's where you get all these efficiencies. It's in cities.
I think Miami more and more is going to take advantage of that cultural diversity. And one of the things that I see with what we call the major arts organizations, the opera and the Miami City Ballet, which has a brand new director, it's Lopez, who danced with ATP and has now come back to the city and hopefully can rejuvenate it as well, is a lot of collaboration. We do a new work week every April where Michael is in town and he's conducting new commissioned works. And this time we're working with the Miami City Ballet and with a new piece of music and new choreography done by Jason Peck. So you're seeing this city sort of get beyond turf wars and realize that in order for us all to survive, we need to be much more collaborative and much more innovative in what we're going to try to attempt to do. And just like Art Basel came into Miami and is growing, now through culture you just see Wynwood and Overtown and all of these other areas really growing. Bernard Arnault of Louis Vuitton has purchased a tremendous amount of land, and they're renovating that. But you see more parks, you see more community and cultural aspects, and I think it is going to be it's a really interesting time to be in Miami now, and it's going to be determined by the people that get together and decide what they want it to become and what's the best way to move forward.
The only thing I would add is it is about this densification and diversity, so that more and more people are moving into cities. I mean, that the flocking to cities is our demographic of the future. So this diversity and this density is the future of cities, and all of what we're talking about will be more and more a part of that. We're seeing this happening on university campuses. I mean, there's a study done in the 40s that said students visit a campus. When they visit, they already know they want to go to school there. They visit it to see how it feels, and they decide within 5 minutes whether or not they want to be there, just based on how it feels. And as we densify campuses for places to live, work, and play, it's like our cities. Our cities are becoming places where people live, work, and play in the hearts of our cities, and it leads to a need for all of this.
Ed?
Well, if I could just add, I mean, that trend, about 80% of Americans live in urban areas.
Yeah.
And that's a huge shift from 50 years ago. And when you look at the world demographic, it's more than 50% with the same angle of incline. And people want to live in interesting places. They want to live where they can go and see concerts on the wall or do yoga in these spaces and be able to walk to these places.
Right.
That is where it's all headed.
With that, I'd like to open up the questions for the audience. Anybody have any questions for the panel in general or for any individuals? We do have Scott with the microphone here.
Hi there, great panel. A quick question about food and the future of cities and landscape design, maybe annuals, that sort of thing to produce food. Your thoughts on those?
I didn't dwell on it, but our Los Angeles State Historic Park is envisioned to have a cafe and agricultural plots where food will be grown to be cooked in the cafe, and kids can come and learn that that's the food that they're growing there and then will be cooked in the cafe. I don't know if anybody knows the history of that site, but it's now known as the cornfields. And the reason it's known as the cornfields, nobody knows for sure, but probably because corn fell off the trains and grew between the tracks. But an artist did a project called Not Cornfields, and she planted the whole site in corn, and then people came and harvested the corn and then ate the corn. So I think the connection of food and urban settings and agriculture and parks is absolutely going to become more and more a program element of every one of our parks.
There are a number of parks that are sort of springing up all over Miami that are growing food for people that can come, and you can work in it, you can go and pick it, it's all fresh, that whole slow cooking movement, and you can eat your way through Miami. It will take months, but you can definitely eat your way through Miami.
Just to add to that, my alma mater, Tulane University in New Orleans, has done a program called Grow Dat. Any of you know the Saints, that's the Who Dat from the Saints, that's why they came up with the name. But it's actually perfectly appropriate for this panel because it's not just a place where they're encouraging people to grow food locally. It's kind of a little cultural center. They're bringing people there to learn about the history of the food, the history of that place, that park, city park, and use it as a way to, as an educational vehicle to help people understand better how to feed themselves and how the city can feed them. So it's a very interactive kind of place, and with a cool pavilion that was designed by Tulane students. Other questions? Yeah, this gentleman.
Hi, thanks so much. My fiance and I might be a little odd. Whenever we go to a place, we'll typically start a spreadsheet, and we'll start a map, and then we'll go to about 15 different websites trying to put together what we want to see where, what are events that have times, those kind of things, but to make sure we see the parks that we want to see, the architecture, the artwork. Have any of you run across, you've talked a lot about integration of disciplines within projects, but integration of disciplines across communities so that you can kind of go to a place, visit it, and have an idea of a planned community that has all those things and is manageable for the average tourist, not an artist and a landscape architect.
Well, I live in New York City, and I would say, and I used to live in San Francisco, but I would say in New York it has become sort of completely blended, where the experience of the architecture and the landscape and the art is on every tourist map in a blended kind of way, which I think is what you're getting at. So it's not like destination architecture, destination landscape, destination art. It's blended.
Well, also, you worked on the Pittsburgh project, didn't you?
We did a proposal for Monongahela Wharf.
Okay.
But I think you're thinking of something different.
Something different. Well, I know there are some communities that have tried to really put together some networks of existing cultural institutions, and and cultural attractions, artworks, architecture, and start to market those and publicize those so people understand them. One community that has done that is Indianapolis. They developed something called the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, and they realized that they had a number of assets, cultural assets, but they weren't viewed as a city that was a cultural mecca. But here were all these different things that were scattered around. So they actually, this was particularly interesting. They entered into negotiations with the city and said, we want to come into those downtown streets that are clogged with traffic, and we want to take away traffic lanes. And of course, people thought they were nuts. But the idea is they wanted to add bicycle lanes and pedestrian lanes, and more importantly, to use these as a way of linking these cultural institutions that people didn't associate with each other. So I think there are some movements at that scale, some very simple website and marketing kind of efforts, but others involving changes to infrastructure, et cetera, to start to weave those things together.
Well, I know Philadelphia has Museum Without Walls that has a wide range of things that related to sculpture, public art, parks, and then interviews as well. And then you have Culture Now, also a website out of New York that tries to do this for different cities nationwide. So we're in this deluge of information, much of it free, but much of it disparate. So you have to go and search. We have no centralized mechanism like that in Phoenix, though it'd certainly be desirable.
We don't have one in Miami either, but what you see springing up are second Tuesdays or first Saturday of the month, where, at least on the beach, we're trying to put something together with all the cultural organizations. So you can go from South Point, the park that Mary Margaret was starting about, all the way up to Collins Park, and stop at all the cultural institutions that are along the way. The Miami City Ballet also has a beautiful building on the beach where the front facade is glass, so you can look in and see them doing their studio work. But it's not exactly what you're talking about, but it sure would be nice to have what you're talking about in Miami.
Yeah.
Hi, really great conversation. It seems like in each of your presentations, there's been a real conversation around creating walkability, livability, sustainability. But to focus a little bit on transportation and transit, it seems like a lot of the sites you're working with were designed in the 50s and the 60s for auto-oriented development. And so the shifts you're making and the products you're working on are encouraging not just parking and people getting out of their cars, but walking there, biking there, and taking public transportation. And in Phoenix, there's the light rail. In Miami, there's the bus system, and there's other networks, but that's a real question. I mean, I work for a public transit agency. I work with buses in the area between DC and Baltimore. And we talk about infrastructure such as transit shelters and creating art out of that. How do you work with the transit network? And sometimes that changes around the projects, but do transit companies, do transit agencies, how do you work to make the transportation network work for your site?
I can speak to one project in particular that we're working on in Denver, and it's an emerging new neighborhood around Denver Union Station, which is in Lebow, lower downtown. And it's a new neighborhood, all new development, but it's centered around the train station, so the rail that comes in and out. Underneath the whole site will be the buses, a major bus hub. The 16th Street shuttle will come to this site, and light rail will come to this site. So it really is going to be a neighborhood and developers are developing, even in this economy. So it really will be a neighborhood, and we did all the public realm, that is truly about 4 different transit systems coming together. So
it's a huge, transportation is a huge issue in Miami. On the beach, if you're lucky enough to be on the beach, you can walk to almost anything, and they're great trolleys buses that you can get on for a quarter. But getting to the beach, there's no other way to describe it but a pain. You know, you have 3 bridges, and if there's a problem on any one of them, you're sunk. There's been a plan in the works for something like 15 years to have transportation around the bay, and it hasn't gotten anywhere yet. So that's a huge issue for all of us, because when we've got a concert that's supposed to start at 7:30 and you literally can't get across the Julia Tuttle, the Venetian Causeway, or 395, we hold a concert, but there's only so long you can hold it. Or if something like Food and Wine Festival is going on at the beach, and nobody can find a taxi to get back to the airport. So there are real issues, that we're looking at. And Miami is a city of cars, and we would like it not to be. But the public transportation, we just got it to the airport. So it's slow coming, but there definitely is a focus and a recognition. This Atlantic Magazine conference we just did, the woman who invented the concept for smart cars and is now doing something with bikes and with cars over in Paris where you can rent your car out. You can't do it in the States because our insurance system is different. But now in France, if you've got a car and you know you're not going to be using it during this particular time of the day, there's a system set up where you can rent it out to somebody else. They use your car, so it's not sitting in a parking lot or sitting in your driveway. You're getting, revenue for that, because think about it. We put a tremendous amount of money into cars, but they sit there. So I think ideas like that are out there, and we're all going to at least investigate whether it seems preposterous on one end. But, we're building lots of access for bikes in Miami now, and so I think it will change. It's just slow, very slow.
I have to say two things about Miami Beach. One, when we were stranded there, we used the bike system.
Isn't it awesome?
It was great, where you just pick up a bike, you put it in your car, and then you ride it for as long as you want to, and there's tons of stations to turn it back in. It worked great. But the other thing that just tickles me about the city is there is that great parking garage designed by Herzog and Nimrod, with that great restaurant on the top. So the parking garage has become a public facility. People get married there. Yeah. It has great views. It has shops. It's fantastic architecture.
Well, the guys who built it actually live in this huge apartment.
Oh gosh.
On top of it. So but they do. You can get married there during Art Basel. There are a gazillion parties that are thrown in a parking garage, because it's beautiful, and the lighting at night is stunning.
One thing that struck me in your question, one of the big initiatives that was making a lot of news around the time we were beginning to think about this was in Abu Dhabi, the Saadiyat Island complex, which is still going forward. It's definitely been scaled back a bit, but initially the plan was for a series of major cultural centers, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, et cetera, that would kind of be plunked out on these little peninsulas, and with roads going up there. And as I say, things are changing, but the last I heard, the Abu Dhabi government had gone back to the architects and was talking about taking parking garages out of those facilities and linking them with light rail in Abu Dhabi, where, talk about car and oil-centered society. So I think there's at least a growing awareness and a willingness to consider these kinds of things, but we all know it's going to take time. And but they're great successes. Our bicycle sharing program here in D.C. A lot of skeptics.
One of the best,
a lot of skeptics, but man, it's really taking off. So I think we'll see more and more of it.
Well, I can just add, Phoenix is more than 500 square miles, and so getting people from A to B can be a challenge, particularly if you don't have a car. It's a car-driven society, pun. But what's interesting about Phoenix is you also have canals which are off-grid because they follow the gradient of the valley. They're becoming, and have been for a number of years, sort of these alternate transportation corridors for bicyclists. So the question for us in looking at these public spaces is, how do we make safer connections across the streets? How do we connect them to the transit that's there? And because we're a city agency, we benefit from working with all of the other departments. So imagine every other department in a city, we work with them on a daily basis. Transit's one of them. And it's mostly in what can you do for passenger comfort and the beauty of stops to help us. And that's where we are in the discussion. But we hear all the time, can you improve bus service? And it's a question of, can you sustain bus service for the cost to spread throughout 500 square miles?
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks. These fascinating projects here, and I want to ask a question of you very quickly, which you'll probably have 3 different answers. Obviously, we're in a different age now where public funding is constrained, and it's not like it was many decades ago where there's a lot of top-down planning and projects. The question is really, so many of these great projects, I want you to think about them, just quickly give us sort of a quick reaction, where a lot of them really require some some very dedicated leadership and vision. And where would you say it's coming from? Is it still with this, is it public sector? Is it private sector? Is it institutional? How do you get there? Where's the energy? It's a hard question, but it...
In my experience, it completely varies. I mean, we have a project in Houston, Discovery Green. It took a mayor and a philanthropist. Our project in Corpus Christi, the opposite. Grassroots citizens are forcing their politicians to embrace it. So it really varies city to city. Although it really helps when you have a mayor, you know, mayors can make tons of difference.
We had a city commissioner that 10 years before this project really started, saved those 2 flat parking lots because we knew that we wanted to do something. And nobody else built on them. So it was that kind of leadership. But I think in ours, it comes from a lot of different places. And it is that synergistic group of people that come together with sort of a single-minded purpose, but not a single approach. You know, we have, it still takes philanthropists. You know, it's really hard to build things of this nature just on a grassroots effort, but you need a base of support as well. But I don't think creativity is just the province of youth, nor do I think it's the province of age. I think creative people are all different ages and they have all different kinds of backgrounds, and when you get them together, something happens. And then you have to have somebody who can actually put it into practice.
My experience has been the same. I mean, I think it's an American phenomenon that the leadership comes from above and it comes from below and it comes from the middle. It comes from all directions. And it's hard to predict or make any general rule about where it's going to come from next. But what is true is that when leaders arise because they have an issue that's important to them, they step up, they can tell the story, and they can convince people. And that's really what it's about.
I should put in a quick plug for the National Endowment for the Arts. A lot of you probably know the program called the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and that has educated so many mayors and has reaped a great deal of difference in our cities.
Well, as one who's had the good fortune to enjoy at least some of the fruits of the labors of all 3 of these people, congratulations, good job, and thank you very much for your participation tonight, and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.